Hi everyone, you're very welcome to this discussion with Professor Jules Coleman at Trinity College Dublin. My name is Dom Lyons, I'm with the School of Law in Trinity, and this is seminar 14 in our speaker series. So we're really delighted to talk to Jules Coleman today, who is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy, Professor of Recorded Music, and Senior Vice Provost for Academic Planning at New York University. So just by way of introduction, Jules Coleman received his BA from Brooklyn College and of the City University of New York, his PhD in philosophy from the Rockefeller Institute, and an MSL from Yale Law School. He's the author of over 100 academic essays and has edited several books, as well as being the author of some key texts, including The Philosophy of Law, Markets, Morals and the Law, Risks and Wrongs and the Practice of Principle, which was drawn from his Clarendon Lectures. Over the course of a 4 decades career, Professor Coleman has taught at the universities of California, Wisconsin, Arizona, as well as Yale and New York University in the areas of philosophy, law, political science, and economics. Prior to his retirement, he served as Senior Provost for Academic Planning at New York University, where in addition to his position in the philosophy department, he was a member of the faculty in the Clive Davis program in recorded music of the Tisch School of the Arts. Coleman has been a distinguished visiting professor at universities the world over, has given over 50 named lectures, and has been awarded several honorary degrees in the United States and globally. And he continues his academic research, completing a book at the moment in the area of everyday ethics, which explores the ways in which we address problems that arise in our everyday life and how those can shed light on similar issues in the law. So I'm really looking forward to discussing this manuscript with you today. Just briefly to note that the goals of this project, and we'll explore this more in a minute, but just very briefly, are firstly to illustrate Professor Coleman's methodological view that there is a genuine benefit in approaching a problem first by identifying its underlying structure as opposed to the particularities of its circumstances or content. Secondly, to demonstrate that there is little point in putting forth a solution to a problem without first seeing if one has fully grasped the depth and essential nature of the problem. And thirdly, to advance a view about the attraction and value of exploring everyday ethical problems. Okay, so I won't go on, but maybe just to kick it off, I'm really looking forward to discussing this upcoming book with you, Professor Coleman. And before we do, perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about your research career to date and how this new work fits in with what you've done over the past 40 years plus of your scholarship.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lyons, for this invitation. And you should call me Jules, and other people should feel free to do so. My first hope is, well, let me say 2 things. One is I hope everyone who's on this or listens to it later takes appropriate precautions to stay safe and healthy so that you'll be able to experience conversations like this and better ones even going forward. So take some due care. So there are, what I was hoping to do, I want to say is something about this. I'm hoping to discuss primarily this new project and show how it relates, begin by showing how it relates to things I've done over the course of my career. But for people who are interested in asking me questions or have some deep felt objections to the views that I've had over the course of the year or the years, or have some views of their own they'd like to share and explore with me, if you would ask those questions in the form of an email sent to Donna, Professor Lyons, and she could forward it to me, I promise that I will respond to every one of them, not because I have a lot of free time on my hand, but because I feel it's part of one's academic responsibilities to do so. And I've always tried to do so whenever I was given the opportunity to do so. So I think over the course of, say, 40 plus years, I've discussed a lot of different things, not all of them well, but I did focus primarily on 3 different kinds of issues. One, let's call it corrective justice and its relationship to tort law, but corrective justice more broadly as well. The second had to do with the nature of law and jurisprudence and so on. And the third had to do with the value of certain kinds of political ideals and values like human welfare, well-being, justice, and efficiency, and the relationship of all of them to one another as they get played out in our ordinary lives and the way in which they get played out in the law and elsewhere. So I got stimulated. So I think it's important to draw a distinction between how you get interested in a particular topic and what conclusions you reach, not only about that topic, but what methodology you use to explore or investigate the topic. So the corrective justice was kind of interesting for me in the sense that I had experienced earlier in my life certain individuals in my family and outside of my family who felt wronged, that a certain kind of misfortune had befallen them, and felt that they had a claim which would be something that was in between a claim that someone else was accountable for and had to answer for, and the idea that there was a matter of urgency that was associated with the misfortune that had befallen them. And I asked myself this question to a certain extent: who would have the responsibility of making good this loss, and what would be the basis of the claim that you had, that it was really not just a misfortune that no one is to blame for, or it's misfortune, even if no one is to blame for, that you nevertheless have a legitimate claim to repair for. So it's about the notion of repair for wrongs, rather than the notion of blaming others for what they had done, whether or not it resulted in a wrong at all. And I asked myself, okay, what would make these claims of justice, and what kind of justice would it be? And those are the issues that triggered what ultimately became my interest in corrective justice. And as many people know, I've had different views about the nature of corrective justice over time. And that's largely because of a methodological approach, which I've had my whole life, but was completely unaware of, which is basically what you want to do is understand the problem. And don't jump to any conclusions about what the solution to the problem is. What you really hope to do is see if you understand the full depth and breadth of the nature of the problem, which actually introduced me to a second idea. None of this appeared to me out of thin air, or none of it did I have in advance. It all came to me over time and only upon reflection. And that was, as you're investigating the nature of a problem, you want to look at the structure of the underlying problem. Why? Well, because a lot of problems which seem to be in vastly different fields of human endeavor nevertheless have a very similar structure. And this was, this can sometimes be overstated when, for example, I would say 20 years ago became very popular in rational choice theory to see every problem as either a coordination problem or a prisoner's dilemma problem. The insight of that was looking for the structure of the problem, kind of abstracted from the particulars of it in the context in which it arises, to see if the structure can tell us something about the appropriate form of resolution, if there is a form of resolution. And what's great about doing that, the value of that, is that in lots of other fields, these problems have often come up, and to a certain extent, people have worked hard on solving them, whether in their relationships with one another or just theoretically, academically, with the tools of a particular discipline. And that can provide some insight. And this brought me to a third thing, which was a large part of my overarching methodology, I guess right from the outset, which was that when you think about fields like philosophy of law, it was natural at one time when I was first getting into the field for people to look at law from a philosophical point of view. That is, the people who were philosophers looking at the law, particularly in the criminal law, were people who said, the concept of, in the criminal law, the fundamental concepts of guilt, shame, punishment, remorse, retribution, deterrence, and whatever, these are philosophically related concepts. Let's think about what the content of the philosophical concepts are, and they provide criteria that we then apply to the law. And we either explain the law by trying to fit it into those concepts and the structures that were familiar to us as philosophers, or we are critics and reformers, and we feel that the practices should be restructured or renovated in some way in the light of these philosophical principles. And I kind of rejected that view, and I think most of my career is devoted to working out an alternative view, which is, to some extent, we learn a fair amount about our philosophical concepts and our moral concepts by taking a look at how they get played out in the various institutions, including legal institutions. So rather than looking at legal institutions as fodder for philosophical analysis, let's look at legal institutions as ways of shedding light on some of our concepts. For example, if you want to understand the nature of corrective justice, you might want to look at various institutions that at least purport and plausibly can claim to be expressing or giving, realizing in practice, a conception of corrective justice, and other kinds of institutions that are offered as alternatives to corrective justice, like a broadly speaking, first-party, state-funded, universal insurance plan to cover all misfortunes, whether they were caused by somebody or accidental mishaps or whatever, just lump them all together. Does this sort of suggest an alternative way of dealing with misfortune that doesn't rely on conceptions of corrective justice, that doesn't impose duties of corrective justice or rights of corrective justice? And all this will be illuminating about the role, the nature of the content of corrective justice, and the role it plays in our social and moral lives together. And so this led to the last methodological view that I had, which was played out to a certain extent in the practice of principle, not well. And I used to really dislike that section of the practice of principle, in part because it was just preliminary thoughts, and I didn't do a particularly good job of explaining it, I don't think. And that was that, we have these concepts set boundaries if we're to use them appropriately, but also they're also somewhat undeveloped, inadequately developed. And the further development of these concepts depends upon the practices in which they figure. And so it became important to me to explore the practices in which various concepts figure for the purposes as part of seeing what our existing conceptions are of various significant concepts. And so this interplay, this desire to see what practices we actually have that play out these concepts and give content to them, is an essential part of what I've thought about my whole life. And I think that sort of ties together the range, not the subject matters themselves. It doesn't explain why corrective justice is related to the theory of the law, and that those are related to the notion of welfare and what have you. That I have no idea as to whether they relate at all, other than my own personal experience and interests. But this explains the way I approach them, or have tried to approach them. And the fundamental desire has always been to see if I myself actually understood the nature of the problems as well as I might, and whether I could help set a path for others and myself to work on these problems, unbounded by constraints of others, like feeling that you were so-and-so student and you had to have this and that view, rather that this you can do on your own. You should be encouraged to do it on your own. And I think that probably explains why no student of mine has ever held any of the views that I do. Which brings us to the current project, which we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to say again to the attendees, you're very welcome to ask questions in the Q&A box. But our plan today is to talk about this most recent project about everyday ethics. So if you wouldn't mind, if you have questions about Professor or Jules's former work and all that he's just described, you can email them to me. But if you could focus your questions today on what we're about to talk about now, which is your upcoming manuscript on everyday ethics. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So one of the things I think is again, it's a little bit about philosophy and one of the roles that philosophy plays in our lives, and things from philosophical examples and the role that they play in our lives, to the fact that philosophy has lost a certain degree of influence on how people live and how our politics are carried on. And that's unfortunate. Part of it, I think, is a problem of philosophy. It's not all a problem of philosophy, but part of it is that philosophy tends to use particular concepts and to use a particular kind of language in order to express examples and issues and to discuss them, explore them, investigate them, and solve them that are generally inaccessible to a lot of people. And I think that's unfortunate because I don't want to say that our mental health needs philosophy more than ever, or that our social or political health needs philosophy more than ever, but it couldn't hurt, as my mother would have said, like chicken soup. I'm not saying that chicken soup solves everything, but it couldn't hurt. So I think the general idea is, philosophy couldn't hurt, and it has a role to play, and it's lost its capacity to a certain extent to play that role. So if you think of Anthony Appiah, who I much admire, and I view him as a good friend, and I really admire his work in general as a philosopher, but his work in the New York Times on ethics, that's typically someone writes in and gives a problem, and he gives advice, philosophers kind of advice about the problem. If you happen to be thinking about it morally, which would be a healthy thing to do and the right thing. But this is kind of the opposite of that. Rather than people writing in and asking me a problem and seeing what I think about it, which may or may not be interesting or may not be helpful, I've got it the other way around. I like to think that there are probably lots of problems that show up in a lot of different circumstances. And they show up in the circumstances of everyday life or everyday experience for people all the time. And my interest is trying to figure out what they think about it, how they resolve it, what practices people have developed in order to work through or resolve certain kinds of dilemmas, that the richness of the human experience in working through with one another and individually certain kinds of moral issues and the like, and things which may not even appear like moral issues, is very valuable, it seems to me, in my desire to try to formulate and discuss the issues, explore what arises in the nature of the problems, and then feed it back to people to see what they think about that. So my goal is to publish a book online, which I will sell for 99 cents, just so, like my psychiatrist says, if I gave it to you for free, it wouldn't be valuable to you, which of course is nonsense, but I understand. In any event, so the idea is I'm following the Radiohead principle. 99 cents, if you can afford more, you pay more. But then the idea is I'm on the board of a large company that has digital communities. And what I want to do is use the software that we've created in this company to encourage people to participate in discussion groups about these problems, to add other problems as they emerge, run a prize every 6 months, which would become a publication for the person who comes up with a really good puzzle that gets other people interested in, that they explore and so on, and that this becomes sort of a philosophizing community broadly among ordinary, curious individuals. And I don't use ordinary in a pejorative way. I grew up in Brooklyn, and I'm the first person in my family ever go to college, so I'm as ordinary as the next guy, or person. So that's the overall strategy. And if I may, I can use a couple of examples to illustrate what I have in mind. So one problem that I think not everybody faces, but one problem a lot of people saw, I'll use the Kentucky Derby of 2019. So in the Kentucky Derby of 2019, a horse called Maximum Security won the race, but then was disqualified. Now, the way the Kentucky Derby is set up is that they have stewards who have the tape of the race. But the stewards who have the tape of the race do not, on their own, without someone first lodging a complaint, either determine the race was fairly run or not fairly run. So a complaint has to be lodged. So a good question to ask, which is a question which comes up in the law, is who would have authority to lodge a complaint, who would have standing to do so. So in this horse race, you might think Though if there was a horse who felt that they were wrong, or a driver who felt that they were wrong, a jockey, that would be the person who would have the standing to lodge the complaint. And then the question would be, what evidence would be brought forward and what would be the appropriate remedy if the person was wrong. Well, in fact, the jockey who drove the horse that was interfered with, or alleged to have been interfered with, or could have alleged to have been interfered with, did not lodge a complaint. Because when asked, the reason the jockey gave was, well, the race was over by the time we were interfered with, and we were out of it. And maximum security was winning going away. And so it was pointless. It had no impact, a kind of like basketball, the no harm, no foul. Yeah. It didn't have an impact on the game. And so we're not lodging a complaint. But alas, the horse that finished, the jockey of the horse that finished in second place did lodge the complaint. And the complaint was found out to be legitimate. Maximum security did interfere with one horse. The complaint was lodged by another horse. The maximum security was disqualified. The horse that was lodged the complaint was the horse, believe it or not, I'm using the horse loosely to speak of the jockey. That horse actually was moved into the winner's circle and became the winner of the race as a result. And this, so the question I went around asking a lot of people afterwards was this fair? Just a crude question, was this fair? Now, what's fair? What became the next question? Are you asking me, if you prompt people, they kind of ask you a question. And the question is, when you ask, is this fair, what does the it refer to? Namely, that someone lodged a complaint who wasn't the person who was wrong. Okay, let's work with that one. Someone lodged a complaint who wasn't the person who was wrong. Well, under what conditions do we think that that's appropriate? So I ask people, what are the conditions under which you think it's appropriate for someone other than the individual who was wrong to lodge a complaint against the wrongdoer? Good question. Right? And of course, you immediately, as lawyers, people who are listening to this, or people think about the law, think, oh, well, this is a question about standing, and it's also a question about wrongdoing and how we enforce different kinds of wrongdoing, right? So that was the next question I asked. Well, this is an issue about whether the wrong, I said, is a wrong that is an unfairness in how a race is run, versus a question about it's a wrong to a particular party whose particular race was adversely affected by it. And then that raised the question, well, when would you draw distinctions between cases in which the relevant wrong is a wrong to everybody, or to how a race is wrong, or an unfairness in competition, given an interest we have in fair races being run, rather than a wrong to a particular person who was adversely affected by how their race was run as a result. Okay, and that got people interested in thinking about the difference between public and private enforcement. And now this raises a difference that people in the law have thought about, namely the difference between thinking about public and private enforcement as two sides of the same coin when you have an optimal enforcement budget and you're trying to split it up between public enforcement by police and prosecutors and private enforcement by people who are injured. Yeah. So that gives you an idea of the kind of issues that this book discusses and about which ordinary folks, presenting it to them without actually presenting any deep concepts that are not familiar to them, that are completely available to people. So the hard work for me, but the enjoyable work for me, is trying to find a way to express these kinds of issues and concerns in a language that doesn't too heavily rely upon concepts that are less than fully familiar,
Yeah.
or involve language that is too precise or too narrowly focused and not available.
Yeah. I think people on here would be really interested in discussing these issues on your website when you set it up. So do feel free to send it on to me, and I'll circulate details amongst.
Sure. Got to send the book. I've got to sell it to these people. These
Yes,
people.
yeah, 99 cents each. We'll get at least
No,
30.
these people are the $14.99 type.
So I think you've answered most of my questions, but maybe just to draw out the mental health issue a little bit.
Sure.
How could a philosophical approach to grappling with day-to-day issues assist with challenges in the area of mental health? So I think you said at some point in our preparatory discussion that this is a way of approaching problems that can be a source of insight and self-reflection and comfort for people. Would you like to say more about that?
Sure. I'd be, people who know me know that I probably would like to say a lot about a lot of things. So a fortiori, I'd be happy to do something about this. But I try not to say things I don't know much about, say a lot about them. So this one is a little more complicated. So let me do it in two stages. One is what a view I have that I've never expressed and only have recently thought about, and I wouldn't say come to because I'm not sure I've really settled on it, about the role of these kinds of puzzles for philosophers, just in general. Why philosophers are concerned, why the trolley problem, right? Let's just take the trolley problem that people have thought a lot about. Now, so I think I'll say, because the trolley problem is another example I use in my book, all right? So
and would you like to briefly just summarize that for people who aren't familiar with it?
Sure.
In one sentence.
What?
Just in one sentence.
Okay. Well, no, I don't know if I could do it in one sentence. But there's a trolley that's unmanned going down a track. There's a fork in the road, and one track becomes two tracks, and on one track there are 5 people who are tied to the track, and that's the track that the trolley would be normally going down. And on the other track, there's one person who's tied to the track, and these people presumably can't get up or escape. And then there's a bystander who's out on a walk with the dog, say, and comes upon the lever that can change the track, sees the trolley coming, sees the people on the track, is made aware of this, has an adequate amount of time. And the question is, the question we might ask from a psychological point of view is, what would this person do? What should enter their mind? And this becomes narrowly, what does morality require of this person to do or permit the person to do? And the question is whether the person is required to not divert the train, whether the person is permitted to divert the trolley, or whether or not the person is required to divert the trolley. So that the question is, what's permissible, what's obligatory, and what does a person have a right to do? If they wanted to. So that's the fundamental question. And most people who focus on that question focus exactly on that deontic question and a related blameworthiness question. Is it blameworthy? Is the person a proper object of blame in the event that they divert the trolley? And that should, to a certain extent, depend upon whether it's permissible, obligatory, or not. And I think that's a real interesting question. And people have written about it for 30 or 40 years, right? I don't think that's the most interesting question. So I wasn't planning on discussing this, but I'm happy to discuss this. I think there are lots of questions from the exact same set of facts that are at least as interesting as the one that everybody has written about forever. So the ones that I'm interested in the following. The first one is one that other people have thought about. Fine, but I've thought about it in a slightly different way. What they've thought about is this one. Suppose the person who is the one tied to the track can't get up and leave, but has a gun and could shoot. So the question becomes, is it permissible for him to shoot in self-defense, preemptive self-defense, the bystander, right? And then the question for some would then be, is that an innocent shooting an innocent bystander who's maybe doing what they're morally required to do, not just permissible to do, but suppose your view is that they're morally required to divert the trolley to save the lives of 6 people. Whatever, is it permissible to shoot that person who is not acting wrongfully, who's acting permissibly, or may in fact be doing what they're required to do? That's the question some people have thought about. Now, there's a variation on that question, which the one I thought about is this. If you think it's permissible to shoot the bystander, do you think it's permissible to shoot the other 5 people? Why is that a reasonable question? Well, it's a reasonable question for the 2 reasons. The first is, if you think it's permissible for the person to divert the trolley, part of your reason for thinking that it's permissible to divert the trolley is that you save 5 lives at the expense of 1. But if you shoot the bystander and you think that's permissible, you're actually killing 6 people. Yeah. You're killing the bystander and the 5 people who are on the track. But surely if you just shoot the 5, you're saving 1. You're killing 5 rather than 6. So why isn't it permissible to shoot the 5? And you say, well, of course they had nothing to do with it. But again, the 1 had nothing to do with it either. That is, you say, well, they're just a consideration, they're not the cause. Well, that depends on what your view is on a background condition versus a cause, doesn't it? And so you'd want to think about that question as well. All right, so that's one interesting question. But then there's another interesting question, which is this. If you divert the trolley, if the bystander diverts the trolley, but does not kill the 1, but merely injures the 1, does the 1 have a right to be compensated? And against whom does the 1 have a right to be compensated? Is it against the bystander, who's the, broadly speaking, cause, narrowly conceived, or is it against the 5 who are beneficiaries? Mm-hmm. Now you might say, well, this reminds us of a maximum security case, right, in which the beneficiary is the person who sues. Well, here's, right, who lodges the complaint. The number 2 horse lodged the complaint. That's the beneficiary. And that makes some people feel a little uncomfortable about that they're the beneficiary. But of course, whistleblower laws are entirely devoted to the idea that a person becomes a beneficiary by blowing a whistle on wrongdoing. So it's okay in some circumstances. So let's get really crazy about this. So there are the 5. Now, if the 5 and the 1 could have negotiated with one another, beforehand, let's suppose they were only 15 feet apart, surely the 5 would have said, hey, buddy, over there, what would it take for you to take the hit from this trolley in order, because I'm sure we would be prepared to pay for it. Now, forgetting whether or not the contract would be enforceable, we can imagine circumstances under which an individual would say, there is an amount of money, this is the amount of money, and so on. Now, shouldn't we ex post require the party to pay who would have made the contract ex ante, rather than the person who caused it? And this just raises a question about the difference between an ex ante perspective and an ex post perspective, which is another issue that I discuss in the book. Now, the question is, why do we focus on these kinds of, why do philosophers spend so much time on these kinds of puzzles, making them up? You don't have to make them up, because in the real world, they happen all the time. And I remember when I was teaching law, I used to say philosophers who I much admire, like Francis Cam, are always making up incredibly complicated examples and then asking us to explore them forever and find out what our intuitions are about them. But I always used to say, as a law professor, the law's got much better examples. These things happen absolutely all the time. You don't have to make them up. Well, why do we make them up? What's their value? Now, I don't think their ultimate value is that they help us solve a moral problem. I don't believe that for a second. I mean, first of all, there's still disagreement. The disagreement is serious. We haven't figured out what the answer is, but we're enriched in our understanding of the aspects of the complexity of our lives together and the problems we run into, and the difficulty of thinking about what's the appropriate way to resolve them. And our sense that no matter how we resolve a vast majority of these, we are going to have feelings of guilt, responsibility, a sense that there was a loss that someone should have been able to do something about, raise questions about whether we should think of institutions or create institutions for dealing with these kinds of circumstances, whether even if we created this, it would take away our sense of personal responsibility for it. It would not, right? They help us, they're like literature. Philosophers' version and lawyers' versions of literature. A good case, well constructed in the law, is a piece of literature about the human condition. And my view is we get a deeper understanding of ourselves, our relationship to one another, that provides empathy, sympathy, and to a certain extent, a kind of personal relief. It's not just guilt that we feel. It's not just responsibility that we feel. We understand that these kinds of issues arise all the time. We don't beat ourselves up as much as we otherwise would. We shouldn't beat ourselves up as much as we otherwise would. That focusing on these problems gives us a sense of just how complex the circumstances we face in our lives are, how hard we try, and how inevitable our failures will be. And that is a good thing to get one's head around, with regard to one's personal mental health, as well as our communal lives together.
Well, Patricia in the Q&A says, thank you, Professor Coleman. This is badly needed. Your book is very valuable for all of us on an everyday basis. And Nicholas Franco says, my question is, who is tying all these people to train tracks? So I think that's rhetorical, but I do have Colette Whelan on the line, and she...
Well, he's a friend of mine, and I wouldn't...
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe you want to answer that.
Oh, I definitely do not want to answer any of that. He's in private equity, and he doesn't deserve to have these things answered.
Well, thanks for your question.
No, I'm only kidding.
I have Colette Whelan on the line, is a student in law and political science in Trinity, and she has a question for you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, how are you? It's been fascinating listening to you so far. And my question is about, you're talking about fairness earlier. And
yes.
One thing which I've always personally thought is unfair is in Ireland and the UK, possibly the States, I'm not sure. If you're, say, stuck at traffic lights and a car goes into the back of you and then you're shunted into the car in front of you, you're liable for the damages to the car in front of you, even though technically it wasn't your fault. You had no option, you were just shunted. So although, yes, you did hit the car in front, ethically, should you be held responsible? I mean, the law says yes, but ethically, should you?
Well, the question is, how do you feel about that? So, for example, if you're
I don't think it's fair.
Well, tell me what you think of the following case, because I like structure, right? Remember, one of the things I'm in favor of is looking at the structure of a problem.
Yeah.
So suppose, what you're thinking is you're just an innocent instrument.
Yes.
That's being thrown into someone else, and that you shouldn't be liable. Libel is a kind of vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
You're vulnerable. What are you vulnerable to in this case? What you're vulnerable to in this case is the cost of the injury to the car in front.
Yes.
So let's just keep the notion of vulnerable and innocence. Suppose you're a baby who's picked up by a wrongdoer. Not a baby, that's just makes it gross. Let's say I'm picked up by a wrongdoer who is in self-defense, hurls me, or in an act of violence, hurls me at someone else who's below. And if I land on that person, I will squish them to death.
Right.
And the person below has a gun or a spear to protect themselves from having me land on them. And as I get closer and closer and closer, they stick the spear out, which is very large, and goes right through me, not only slows me down, but actually kills me, which is really a bummer for me. But here I am, an innocent who's being used as a tool of another person who might injure the innocent person at the bottom. And I'm made vulnerable to actions taken by the third person in self-defense, right? Now, is that a permissible, the first question is that a permissible thing for the victim to do, the potential victim, the person underneath?
Yes, I would hate to see it happen, but I could see why they would take that action. Because it's either they get injured, possibly killed if somebody comes at force and speed, or they kill to protect themselves.
Well, I'm not saying, I agree. Yeah, I'm not saying it's the same problem, because it's obviously different. Because when the car hits the other car, it may be an innocent car in the middle.
Yes.
And but it's not threatening to kill anybody. And the third car, the car in the front, the one that stopped at the red light, is not going into or hitting back the other car, right? They're just taking a blow. Now, to make it exactly similar, you would think rightly, here would be your point, rightly, if I got injured at the bottom of the cave when the person was thrown down on me, I should get to recover against the first person, the person who threw me, right? And that's like your example, right? So it's a question of fairness. It doesn't look like that party is a responsible cause. It's merely a instrument. Now, the law has a slightly different question to answer, because the law says you, as the second car, typically the middle car, can sue the first car to recover your damages, both from the first car and from the cost that you had to pay to the third car. So then you might say, well, now we have a different problem. You're suing, we've got too many lawsuits.
Yeah.
Right? We have too many lawsuits. The car in the middle is suing the first car for that car pushing him or her. And then that damage to the back of my car. Then I'm also suing that person to recover for the damages I have to pay to the third car that's sitting at the stoplight. So it's not really a question of fairness, because we could solve the fairness issue. We could solve the fairness issue by saying the car in the middle has to sue the first car, the third car sues the second car for the damage it had, and the second car, the car in the middle, sues the first car for the damage it experienced, but the damage it experiences were of two sorts: the damage to the back of its car and the liability it has for the damage to the third car. And then, so that's a fairness solution, but it's an inefficient one. So the problem with our current practice is something like, really, we get too many lawsuits. Why doesn't the first car, or the car at the stop and the car in the middle just both sue the first car?
Yeah.
Right. So it isn't, you might say, from a certain point of view, it's not really a question of fairness, because there are ways in which fairness can solve this problem, or it can be solved in ways that are not unfair. It's just that there are too many lawsuits. And so what's wrong with the existing law is it makes the second car sue the first car, the third car sue the second car, when both the second car and the third car can sue the first car.
So it needs to be rewritten then.
So here's my quick answer. Don't drive.
Good answer. Thank you very much for that.
Appreciate
it. About climate issues as well. Thanks so much, Colette. And Bláthnaid Carney is on the line, and Bláthnaid is an LLB graduate of Trinity, and she is also training in King's Inns to be a barrister. So she has a question for you, Jules. Go ahead, Bláthnaid.
Thank you.
Hi, Jules. Thank you for a really, really insightful discussion so far. And I guess what kind of came to mind relates directly to your discussion surrounding the accessibility of philosophical language to ordinary people. And I think that's particularly relevant, current with the COVID situation at present, and it's conversations that have come up on a daily basis for me, because, the world is currently stymied by ethical considerations that, while people might not have the language, and relating back to the trolley problem that you brought up, people understand that the question at the minute is the preservation of life. But as it stands, it's nearly threefold. It's the COVID patient, the cancer patient, or someone's ordinary job. and how the three of those kind of come within that question. So I wonder whether you think this might be a really opportune time for ordinary people to benefit from and potentially engage with broader questions of philosophy. And I suppose, again, whether you don't have to comment on this if you don't want to, but whether you think any one country is doing the right thing to balance these ethical considerations.
Well, I'd like to steer clear of the second part of your question, other than to make the obvious intervention or comment, which is the United States is not. It's not doing a very good job on any of it. And embarrassingly so, and dangerously so, immorally so, you name it, we're doing as bad a job as humanly possible. But I do think, and let me give you a couple of examples, which I would like to put in the book, I may put in the book, which have to do with the current circumstance, because they're very good. They're very good examples. I always used to use the following example to bring this point up, but the current one is better. The current COVID situation, which has spawned nothing but misery for people, but it does have raise an interesting philosophical problem. And the problem I've always brought up is, what about a person who's born with an eggshell head? Because they're like Humpty Dumpty. That is, their head is easily cracked. And think of a person with an eggshell head as like Humpty Dumpty. So when they go outside, they're very vulnerable to people injuring them, doing ordinary things. Now the question is that a cost of the person with the eggshell head, or is that a cost of everybody else? That is, and how would we mediate and determine whose that should be a cost of? So some people might think, well, people don't have notice. You'll see where this goes in COVID in a moment, because again, going back to one of my earlier points, I'm kind of stuck on this idea of looking for the underlying structure as being the same in a lot of different areas. A lot of people might say, look, I don't know who's got an eggshell head. Am I supposed to walk around everybody? And because otherwise I'll be held liable for running into them and causing them all sorts of damage. I don't want to cause brain damage or things like that. So should I not go out of my house? Should I walk very far away? Can't we just solve this problem by having the person wear a sign that says I have an eggshell head? You know, so giving a warning to everybody that they have an eggshell head, like cigarettes, I'm dangerous, you know, so I'm a danger to you. Well, I don't feel like I'm a danger to you. That is, it's odd to think that here I am with a birth defect of some sort, that I have an eggshell head. It's a vulnerability of me. Why is my vulnerability of me a danger to you? Well, okay, let's slow down for a second. But it is a danger to me in some sense, right? This is a lot like in the coast problem, whether or not you fence the cattle out or fence the cows in, right? I'm sorry, the corn in. That is, who's the burden fall on? Whose problem is it? What kind of, who's the responsible party? Whose loss is it? A cost of what activity is it? Let's go to the COVID case. If we could have thought of this in advance and we knew that 95% of the people who would be deeply, now this turns out to be false, but let's suppose it were true. 95% or 97% of the people who would be adversely affected and put at greatest danger by COVID were people in nursing homes and elderly people over the age of 65, which sadly, I know this may come as a shock to you, I am. Right? I fall into that vulnerable group. Those people are like people with eggshell heads. The rest of us could go about our ordinary lives if they would just stay in the house. And there are many people who've held a version of this view, namely that we should have lockdowns for the 65-year-olds and up. If we had lockdowns for the 65-year-olds and up, then everybody else could go about our business, and there'd be, of course, some adverse effect in the economy, but not barely as much. And then people say, but of course, you're imposing these costs on the 65 and older. I say, well, hold on. They're imposing the costs on us. by being so vulnerable and going outside. That's the eggshell head, right? So these kinds of issues are exactly the issues that people grapple with. And you don't need a philosophy degree or a law degree or to have understood the Coase theorem as the Coase theorem in order to be able to think through and worry about these kinds of problems and have insightful things to say, because it's natural that after a while, you'll find yourself saying the second thing. Okay, if we were to require people to be on lockdown inside, who are 65 years old and above, there'd be a question, of course, about how do we enforce that? But don't we now, as beneficiaries of their being under lockdown, don't we have a burden to compensate them for their loss? And then other people would say, but why would we have to compensate them for a loss? We're just keeping them from putting us in danger. So that raises a general question about sometimes, rather than punishing the people who put us in danger, maybe we should subsidize the people who put us in danger not to put us in danger. And that is just, no one needs a law degree or a philosophy degree, but these issues come up in philosophy all the time, in morality. They come up all the time in law. And I think we would all benefit from being able to discuss them more broadly without relying too much on a set of concepts and a language that is exclusionary.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks, Blanche. I think that'll be very interesting now for people to watch the recording of this and to get an insight into the application of philosophical theorems into the COVID situation. Marta Markey is also on the line and has a question for you. So
Sure.
Marta is a PhD student in Trinity and is funded by the Irish Research Council. She had a career in journalism before coming into the law, and she has a question for you, Jules. Go ahead.
Well, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Hi, hello. I really like the inclusivity of your new book and the empirical element of this project. I think, it's really interesting. So, but my question is, after you present these ethical problems to people and they come back with answers, and let's say in response to the trolley dilemma, most people say that the best way to address it is, I don't know, solution A. Does this mean that solution A, so the majority view, is the right view? Is philosophy a democracy, or are there some other standards for deciding which solution is, more morally superior?
Right. So I think that that's a very fair question. I certainly don't hold the view that what most people hold is the right view is therefore the right view because most people hold it. That would not be a plausible thesis to have. But it would be an interesting fact to explore why people have the views that they have. If most people come to a particular view, they may come to it for a variety of different kinds of reasons. And the real interesting thing is to explore the kinds of reasons and the nature of the kind of reasoning that people have. And my goal is not to reach conclusions about what's morally right and wrong, since, to be honest with you, on very controversial and complicated issues, I often have no idea and find myself drawn to arguments and conclusions of very different sorts at different times as I try to put myself in the shoes and the arguments of other people. So, but the idea is to get people engaged in this. The idea is not to find a winner. It's to increase engagement. I think there's, on these issues, there's both, see, what too much reliance on authority leads to a certain kind of disdain for authority. Too much reliance on expertise leads to a kind of disdain for expertise and elites. And my view is it's really hard to be an authority on anything, And so people who earn their position as really genuine authorities on a couple of topics, for that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And you want to listen to people when you're not an authority. And on a lot of these moral dilemmas, I don't think any of us are really authorities. And on these kinds of puzzles that we face in everyday life, every one of us is as much an authority, potentially as much an authority as anybody else. Not just because they have a view and an opinion. One of the things I always used to say to my students was, I don't want to hear your opinions or your views. I want to hear what arguments you have, what reasons you have for things. And you have to learn how to develop a capacity for reasoned thought in defense of a position and be subject your position to arguments from other people and have the give and take of that and come out with a sense of modesty about your views in confidence ultimately in how you choose to lead your life. But the goal is to deepen your understanding of one another and to make the project of all of ours getting on with one another, facing the problems that we face, a successful one.
That makes sense. Thanks so much, Marta. Thanks, Jules.
Thank you very much.
So we're close to the end of our time, unfortunately.
I can't believe that's true.
I know. We'll do it again. Let's reschedule. Let's schedule another, because this has been fascinating. It's wonderful for everybody to have the opportunity to hear this reasoning in play. So I just want to say a huge thank you, Jules, and thanks to everyone for attending and brilliant questions. We're really looking forward to this manuscript and the discussion that follows it. Obviously, the book touches on very important issues relating to moral philosophy, ethics, broader social challenges such as mental health ties in there. And so I'd like to express my sincere gratitude for sharing these insights with the college community and beyond. I think it's a very important discussion. I've no doubt people will widely view the recording and read the book and engage in this conversation. So thank you so much. And is there anything else you wanted to raise that we haven't touched on before we wrap up?
Two things. One is I definitely wanted to thank you for inviting me to participate. I view it as an honor and an opportunity to share with other people. I've had the good fortune over the course of my life to be able to share whatever ideas and whatever thoughts I've had that have been useful with people at particular institutions. And one of the great goals that we're able to realize in the modern world is to share and to hear from people more broadly. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that. And so I wanted to thank you for providing me with that opportunity. And the second thing I want to say is take any of the examples we discussed today and think a little bit more about them. And I leave you with one simple version of that. Would it have mattered in the maximum security Kentucky Derby if the interference had happened right outside the gate? Which it does. It did. Always does. If you're in the Kentucky Derby, there are 21 horses. So does the time at which an offense occurs matter, as opposed to whether or not offense has occurred? Mm-hmm. So, for example, people always say in a baseball game or a basketball game, I don't know anything about cricket. I've watched it a million times. I can't figure out anything about it, so don't ask me. But I do know something about, a little bit about soccer. But I played baseball and I played basketball and so on. People say, I want the referee to be fair. And by fair, they mean if it's a foul in the first quarter of the game, I want them to call it in the end of the game. If they don't call it as a foul at the beginning of the game, I don't want them to call it at the end of the game. But I think that whether it's at the beginning of the game or the end of the game actually matters to whether or not you should call it. At the beginning of the game, you can call all sorts of fouls because you want to control how the game goes on. You want to give a certain rhythm to the game. You want it to be played in a certain kind of way. And what you're doing is managing the game, just like a judge manages the docket and manages a case. But by the end, things which you called as a foul at the beginning of the game to help manage the game, you're not going to call at the end, because that purpose of calling them as fouls has passed. And so the question of what the role time plays in our moral judgments and ethical judgments is extremely important, but often missed.
Yeah. So yeah, that's something we can all think about, and maybe we'll have another discussion in the coming months.
I'm sorry for running over.
No, not at all, not at all. It's absolutely fascinating, and you haven't run over. Actually, we have. We're just at the time, but it's really fascinating, and it's great, yeah, to bring in these perspectives maybe that have been missed over the years, and hopefully with fresh insights from young people and more mature scholars, that maybe we'll get somewhere. So thank you so much again, Jules. And with that, I'll close the session.
Thank you, Donna. I appreciate it very much. And I thank everyone for joining who did.
Take care.